Well, hey, Thunder Bay, it's the old Wiley Coyote on the Paradigm Shift Cafe. Thanks for having us along on your Friday afternoon as you're finishing up your paperwork at the desk or tidying up the tools. Whatever it is, I'm glad you've got us on maybe in the background. And we've got a great show coming up, at least an hour, maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours of a good conversation around the environment, the local environment, and the broader North American environment, and even global to that extent, around the rather serious issues around nuclear waste deposition and disposal. And we have one of our good American neighbors coming up, Kevin KAMPS, if you want to just get on your Google machine already and get ready for a good conversation, I hope. So let's keep it rolling here. We'll get us off the tarmac with a little tune from, who have I got here for you? We got some Canadian performers, Matthew Barber and Jill Barber, on a real optimistic note. So thanks for having us along. Folks, for the Paradigm Shift Cafe today, I'm in conversation with Graham Saunders. Hello, Graham.
Good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. You're a returning guest. You've been, I don't know how many times you've been on the show, numerous times for sure, and I'm glad to have you back for representing, as you are, the president of Environment North. Lots to talk about there. We'll get to it in a second, some of that. And Kevin KAMPS, up from the States, as we say up here, and out of Seattle, Washington. Or I mean, Washington, D.C., rather?
D.C.
Yeah, D.C.
The den of corruption.
Yes, okay, right. The den of corruption. There, yeah, we said.
A Canadian colleague came up with that, so I'm plagiarizing. A Canadian.
Okay,
yep.
The den of corruption. I often wondered what the D.C. stood for, and so we're setting the tone. That's good. We got a friendly incursion happening here. Indeed, we do. And you're with Beyond Nuclear, and we'll get to fleshing out a lot of that as we go along in the time that we've got. You're kind of a man in demand here, so we'll see how much time we've got, and there's a lot of ground to cover. But Graham Saunders with Environment North. Now, you folks had your annual general meeting here just up the road here at the Oliver Road Rec Center on yes. Wednesday, and I was sorry I couldn't be there genuinely because you had Kevin there as a guest speaker, Kevin KAMPS here, and so I'm glad we can reiterate some of what went on there and just talk first, Graham, if you would, just a little bit the broad strokes about your involvement with Environment North, what it is, how long it's been around. And then you can, segue into helping us out, introducing our guest, Kevin KAMPS here.
Okay.
Please.
Environment North was founded mainly about Lake Superior water issues in 1972 and persisted through the decades because that problem of water of Lake Superior didn't go away. But we were instrumental in doing a lot of work to reform some of the practices of Lake Superior. And since then, we've been fairly instrumental in getting land dedicated for conservation. Wabakimi Park is one example. And so in the early part of this century, we had a big issue about synfuel. That was a proposal to have a fossil fuel project in Thunder Bay on the waterfront that would use the waste products from the tar sands of Alberta.
Sounds okay to me.
Yeah, and what would happen with all those heavy metals and pollutants? Well, there's money to be made. Anyway, right. We were able to, one of the purposes was to generate electricity in Thunder Bay and ship it, transmit it on a cable on the bottom of Lake Superior to the U.S. And connect with the Midwest grid.
Interesting, yeah.
And it sounds ludicrous to think about doing that, but the problem at the time was that it was easily possible because the company promoting it had done their research and they had a good location that wouldn't be challenged too much, and also it was under the limit of it didn't require
acceptable blah blah blah.
Yeah, it didn't require environmental assessment, which is crazy because it was a new project never done in Canada. So we opposed that and forced it to the environmental assessment stage, and then the whole project folded because they would never be able to do something like this. As I said, you know, how a nice cable at the bottom of Lake Superior, I don't think so. Anyway, so that was a sort of a revitalizing of Environment North about 20 years ago.
Right. And if I may just interject one little thing, which is, and if people often cynically think, oh, what can one voice do or one little group of people? Well, thank you for that, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, some of what's happening right now with the big push for more nuclear in Ontario and Canada and the United States too, is deja vu. This has happened before.
Yes.
Environment North, all those decades ago, was involved in opposing the idea of disposing of high-level nuclear waste near Atikokan. So skip ahead pretty much 50 years, almost 50 years, and now the main circumstance has changed. They moved the proposed site a few kilometers north of Atikokan to between Wabigoon First Nation and Ignace.
Mm-hmm.
So it's remarkably similar, and last time it failed, they weren't able to continue with test drilling. Part of the reason is because we and Environment North and other groups forced it to the hearing stage, having a commission to hear both sides of the argument, you know, some kind of analysis, whether this is a practical solution economically, environmentally. So we sort of won around there. And at the time, in the 1990s, Thunder Bay and people in the city were very opposed to nuclear waste. There was a referendum that we got onto the ballot, and 93% said they did not want nuclear waste disposal in this region. And we also had signs when you enter the city about Thunder Bay being a nuclear-free zone.
Right.
Quite a coup.
I call that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even flyover nuclear, like, you know, it was a nuclear-free zone completely, even in the skies.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure we really prevented those planes.
No,
but
exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, so we're still doing this. I have some concerns about, listeners know about half-lives. So I'm not how many times the people who have been opposed to nuclear waste disposal can keep doing this, but nevertheless, we're doing it again. So we invited Kevin. I guess Beyond Nuclear is sort of sums up our thinking, because if you're worried about nuclear waste, you have to worry about where it comes from. And we have been researching, and Kevin and his group have been researching, how do we get beyond nuclear? I'll point, for example, Germany has shut down its nuclear plants. Are they in crisis? No, they're not. There's glitches, but they're certainly not in crisis, because they're replacing all the energy needs created by nuclear by renewable resources.
Right. Okay.
So Kevin has joined us, and he came to our annual general meeting. We were a little concerned about, there were so many things happening on Wednesday evening in Thunder Bay. We thought, is anybody going to show? Yeah. And the candidates meeting, we have an election underway.
Right.
So I thought, well, I don't know, our numbers are pretty scant. Nevertheless, I was pleasantly surprised that we had about 80 plus people that came to the Oliver Road Rec Center. And
that's a good turnout, yeah.
Yeah, and we had a very enthusiastic audience and lots of good questions. And Kevin gave us, I think, some remarkable insights and data about what's happening in the U.S. And his specialty is nuclear waste. And so we thought he's an ideal guest for our annual meeting, because that's an issue right now. And he's a popular guy around the city. We've had a lot of attention from the media.
Well, and so he should be.
Yeah. Anyway, so
Okay,
he's here in the studio, so
yeah.
take it away.
Okay, very good indeed. Okay, Mr. Kevin Kamps.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I'll let you launch into a little. I understand you've been, or at least with my minimal understanding, you've been kind of at this nuclear, educating the folks about things, dangers and otherwise, for roughly 20 years.
33.
Okay.
Yeah, it all started with, as a child, I was worried about nuclear war. I wasn't active in any way. And then the first experience that got me going was I came out of the public library in my hometown, Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I heard something in the Central Park. And so I walked over, and what it was, I was about to turn 18 in days. It was a Hiroshima commemoration. And I met my first anti-nuclear mentors. It was called the Kalamazoo Valley Alliance. They'd formed in response to the 3 Mile Island meltdown of 1979.
Right.
And this was now 1987, I guess. And so that made an impression on me big time. But what really got me involved was at college, a peace march came through. I was going to school in southern Indiana, Quaker college called Earlham. And the Walk Across America for Mother Earth came through and camped on campus for 3 days. And it so impressed me that I dropped out of college and joined it. It started in New York City. I missed the first leg, so they were now marching westward to Indiana. And so I joined them for the last 2/3 of the walk. So
Right.
altogether, it was 9.5 months. It was 2,500 miles. And it was the 500th anniversary of Columbus. That was a huge part of the walk, protesting that. There was a lot of indigenous involvement.
Right, interesting.
The main issue was nuclear weapons testing in Nevada on western Shoshone land. So that was my big intro 33 years ago.
Right. Wow, that's I wasn't aware. I wasn't even aware of that march, sadly, on my part. But yeah, thank you for that. So you began to kind of join this community, environmentalist, anti-nuclear stuff. And then what sort of capacities did you come in at, and as kind of a spokesman here and there in communities, and how, talk a little more broadly about it before we get into some of the weeds and details.
Well, I got back from the walk to my home in Michigan, and front page headlines, the Palisades nuclear power plant has run out of storage space for its high-level radioactive waste and is now going to store it on the beach of Lake Michigan. So Palisades is about 35.
What could go wrong, Kevin?
Yeah, 35 miles to the west of my hometown is the Palisades plant. I had barely known about it. I was blissfully ignorant. And in the spring of 1993, it was front page news. And so I jumped into the local anti-nuclear group called Palisades Watch, quickly got involved in Don't Waste Michigan, the statewide group. The battle was on at a very high level. The Attorney General of the state of Michigan, he was called the Eternal General because he'd been serving for 37 years, Frank Kelly. It's still a record in the United States. The Eternal General, Frank Kelly, he joined our case. He argued our legal case in federal court.
Really?
And to just show you the power of the nuclear industry in the United States, we lost. The Eternal General of the state of Michigan lost the case because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is given carte blanche. If they say it's safe, it must be safe. And actually, it's devilish details, but the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, perjured itself in court that these containers could be safely emptied of their contents if there was a problem. One of these dry casks, they're steel and concrete containers that's sitting on the beach, was loaded in summer 1994, so 31 years ago, and a couple weeks later, the company admitted it was a defective container. It didn't live up to its design specifications. But the company had promised, and so did the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Judge, if there's a problem, we'll simply put the waste back into the indoor wet storage pool. Well, long story short, 31 years later, this defective container is still sitting on the beach of Lake Michigan, full of high-level radioactive waste, and it's not the only.
It really is still sitting on the beach.
Yes.
Remarkably.
They broke their promise to a federal judge. There was no consequence to them for that.
It's whether it's naivety on my part or just perplexity, it's amazing how far up the hierarchy of powers go beyond even our vision or knowledge, right? Behind the scenes, like you say, there's governments, there's judges, they may be even back in the day for a judge to speak out against these things. Now, we don't have that as much anymore. there's been some stuff within the Trump realm, you know.
Just an hour or two ago, I saw a news headline that the FBI has arrested a county judge in Wisconsin for impeding immigration enforcement. So this constitutional crisis in the United States is worsening as we speak.
Yeah, and that's a whole other discussion, which I'd love to meander with you on. But one thing that I often do say, and many things that I do say in a positive vein about the United States of America, is their Constitution is almost a sacred and godly thing if left intact and abided by, right?
Absolutely.
It is the foundation of the American people, you know, on the very good and positive lens of it all. But we seem to be straying from it and even tampering with it, and certainly not abiding by the language inherent in it, right? So,
the fight is on is a phrase that keeps coming in my mind on a daily basis.
Seems like America in a lot of places were best when they were, you know, chopping trees down in the pioneer state, when we were actually developing things, you know. But now, you know, there's complacency that's crept into our democracy, right?
Yeah.
Like they'll handle it. The government's good. They'll handle it, right?
Exactly. People are too comfortable.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's very serious issues underway. So people really need to step up now.
Nice. So on that note, Mr. Kevin Kamps, thank you again for coming in and discussing these matters with me. To have the folks from the Environment North talking a great issue of our main issue here is that most of the nuclear waste that's proposed to be deposited or discarded is coming up to the Canadian Shield territory. Otherwise, mainly perceived to be really stable ancient rock, which of course all rock is permeable. And when you drive through the rock cuts of the Canadian Trans-Canada Highway, you'll see in the middle of winter, you'll see waterfalls coming right through the faces of them. So that's one problem right there. But anyway, we try to more or less articulate and oppose it on the front of why transport it at all, because you're kind of spreading your problems around. So mostly a transportation thing. But on that note, please talk to me about Beyond Nuclear as a Is it your sort of organization, or your kind of what does that mean for listeners?
Beyond Nuclear was founded in 2007. It's mostly a watchdog on the nuclear power industry, but there's so much overlap with the nuclear weapons industry that we just say,
and I want to talk about that too. Yeah.
We watchdog the nuclear industry, both sides of the coin.
Right.
So my job there is radioactive waste specialist, so these high-level waste issues. And the way I got the job in the first place in D.C. back in 1999, previously at a different organization called Nuclear Information and Resource Service, was I just, by some cosmic coincidence, I described getting involved locally. Our local member of Congress, U.S. Representative Fred Upton, was chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the U.S. House, which is very powerful, has jurisdiction over things like radioactive waste, for example. So he was the top cheerleader. He was a Republican in Congress, top cheerleader for the Yucca Mountain dump in Nevada, ironically enough.
Okay,
I had spent time out there with the Western Shoshone Indians, whose land it is. They were opposed to the nuclear weapons testing beginning in 1951. They were, surprise, surprise, opposed to becoming the nation's high-level radioactive waste dump.
Right.
So I kept getting calls from organizations in D.C. asking me to bird dog Congressman Upton, ask him a question, protest his campaign event, that kind of thing. And so when a job opening came up in D.C., I moved to D.C. and began working in political exile, was my joke. I'd been fighting the nuclear industry in Michigan as a volunteer, and now I was, paid to do it in D.C. at a national level.
Nice.
And we did stop the Yucca
Getting a
Mountain
paycheck
dump.
is nice.
Yeah, it doesn't go a long way in D.C. The cost of living's kind of high, but so I was as broke as I was in Michigan, even with a paycheck. But we did stop that dump. I actually bumped into Congressman Upton.
The Yucca Mountain site.
Yes.
Okay.
He was coming off the House floor after the vote where we got creamed, but there was a Senate vote yet to happen. This is in 2002. And I said to Congressman Upton, you may have won the battle today, but we're going to win the war. And we did win the war. And Yucca Mountain did not happen. We have to remain vigilant against that dump, but we have to fight other dumps now. It's a game of radioactive waste dump whack-a-mole, but we whacked that mole, and more moles have popped up their heads, and we're whacking them right now.
Okay.
So the fight goes on.
So Kevin, if I may, I don't know if you've got a handle on this figure, but roughly how many nuclear generation plants do we have within the United States?
There are 94 atomic reactors still operating. There are 40 more that have shut permanently, a grand total of 135. But unfortunately, we are in such a...
We're looking at reopening some, eh?
Yes, never before done anywhere in the world.
Closed.
And wouldn't you know, with my good luck, the first one is Palisades, my reactor that got me involved.
In Michigan,
it is the precedent setter. I call it a zombie reactor.
You do call it that online, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Because it's been brought back to life.
They're trying to. They shut it on May 20th of 2022, so we're 3 years into this nightmare. But the precedent has already spread to, of all places, 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania, Unit 1, the one that didn't melt down in 1979.
The one of the three of them?
There were two reactors,
two reactors
at 3 Mile Island. Unit 2 melted down on March 28th, 1979. Unit 1 shut down permanently, supposedly, 5 years ago. So in a sense, it's a more dangerous restart than Palisades. Palisades shut down 3 years ago. And the problem is, Palisades in Michigan. It's also spread to Iowa. That's called Duane Arnold. That shut in 2020. And it's even spread to California at Diablo Canyon Units 1 and 2. They never did shut, but they were supposed to have shut last year and this year, the 2 units. Now they're not shutting. But the reason I mentioned 3 Mile Island being so dangerous is it has sat there idle for 5 years. There has not been safety maintenance done.
Right.
And so these safety critical systems are experiencing accelerated corrosion. And then 5 years after shutdown, they decide they're going to bring it back, having neglected, preventing corrosion, for example, in critical safety systems.
Right.
So this is uncharted territory of risk. But on the radioactive waste side of things, they're going to start making waste again. That was a part of the good news of the shutdown. A lot of waste had been made. We have no solution for it. And now they're doubling down on this really bad idea that we don't have a solution for. They're going to start making more waste. Again.
And 3 Mile Island is kind of notorious for, it was a fairly serious so-called meltdown. And it actually, you can talk about this a little bit more, but you've got that footage that you can see, that black and white footage online where the unit is actually just sort of disappearing into the earth. Just kind of buckling like some kind of surreal cartoon, right?
Well, it was a 50% meltdown. They didn't know that for some years because it was too radioactive to get close to.
Right.
And even when they could take the lid off the reactor, ironically enough, my board chair really loves to tell this story. It's ghoulish. There was so much microbial life that was mutated by the high levels of radioactivity in the core that it obscured the water. The cooling water in a reactor is kept very pure to prevent corrosion of the nuclear fuel. Well, it had sat there for some years with this radioactive contamination, and the microbial life was so thick that they couldn't even see what was in there. And so they had to get that out. And then when they finally got it out and could take some photographs, because they have to do this all remotely. It's too radioactive to be in there, of course. And they could now document that it was 50% melted. They had a 50% meltdown. And they like to pretend that nothing got out. A lot got out. And that large amount of hazardous radioactivity that got out went somewhere. It didn't disappear magically into nothingness. And there are health damage reports in the area. Epidemiologist named Dr. Steve Wing from the University of North Carolina documented several types of cancer with elevated rates in the direction of the wind, downwind of 3 Mile Island. None of this has ever been acknowledged officially by the U.S. government, to the detriment of the people who suffered, who died or had cancer. There was out-of-court settlements with these families. Some 2,000 families sued the company. And these out-of-court settlements required a non-disclosure agreement. They can't tell their story. So this health damage remains a secret. If they tell their story, they lose the money.
They lose their benefits.
Yes.
So-called benefits, yeah. And on that note, just again, well, it's all related, but the Fukushima horrendous incident, of course, radiation levels were on the rise as far as Canada. And even into our food supplies and so on, and the little amount of testing that was done in humans and food, and the environmentalist types that watch these things, watchdogs, they did report elevated levels even in the atmosphere and so on, right? So
Fukushima is an ongoing catastrophe, as is Chernobyl.
Right.
And in a sense, as is 3 Mile Island. They have start dates, they don't have end dates because the contamination's out. But at Fukushima, a triple meltdown, unthinkable. Over the course of several days, 3 reactors at Fukushima Daiichi melted down and released immense amounts of radioactivity. The official version is that it's the second worst nuclear catastrophe after Chernobyl. But one of the top watchdogs on Chernobyl, Dr. Alexei Yablokov, who was Yeltsin's environmental advisor in the 1990s, he was a biologist.
Mm-hmm.
He gave a press conference in Washington, D.C. with my coworker, Cindy Folkers, who's our radiation and health specialist, and the executive director of Friends of the Earth, Eric Pico, was also there. This was the Chernobyl anniversary, April 26th of 2011. So it was coincidental that Fukushima happened just before the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl. These Chernobyl events had already been planned, this press conference. And Dr. Yablokov, this expert on Chernobyl, who wrote the book on Chernobyl, he said, actually, Fukushima will likely be worse than Chernobyl. And why is that? Because of the population density of Japan.
Right.
The fact that it's right on the Pacific Ocean, so all that discharge is going into the ocean.
Yeah.
And contaminating the seafood supply.
Life.
Yeah. So, Dr. Yablokov, who has a dog in the fight at Chernobyl, said probably Fukushima is going to be worse. And he did point out that 3 reactors were involved, not just 1. And the truth about Chernobyl is there were 4 operating reactors at Chernobyl. And through heroic efforts that cost lives among the workforce at Chernobyl, the firefighters, the military, the police, the emergency responders, they prevented other reactors at Chernobyl from melting down. They had flaming chunks of core from Unit 4 crashing through the roof of the other units, starting fires inside the other units, and people had to put those fires out. This was nuclear core. This was fuel, giving off deadly doses of radioactivity within seconds if you're near it. And people knew what they were doing, but they did it, and they prevented other reactors from melting down.
And that's, boy, you almost get a little choked up when you hear that. Real human beings going in. It's kind of like the Twin Towers event with the firemen, right?
Yeah.
Humans do react that way instinctively for good reasons, right? And
well, Dr. Yablokov put the number of deaths attributable to Chernobyl. This is controversial, yes. I mean, the United Nations bodies involved, like the International Atomic Energy Agency, tried to maintain that only some 60 people had died at Chernobyl. The firefighters, the nuclear plant workers.
Right.
They held on to that until 2006. But then they were forced to admit under pressure that, over time, maybe 4,000 people, even people far away who were exposed. Dr. Yablokov's figure that he put in a book in 2004 called Chernobyl, the Human Health and Environmental Consequences, put the figure at 986,000 deaths between 1986 and 2004. So it would be worse now. Put another 20 years worth of deaths on there. Another study called the Torch Report, the other Chernobyl report that came out in 2006, Dr. Ian Fairley, who's done work in Canada, he's UK-based, he put the figure in 2006 at 93,000 deaths. So there's this spectrum of estimates of how many people have died because of Chernobyl. And, there's this phrase, the next Chernobyl could be Chernobyl. That's a phrase from Adi Roach with the Irish Chernobyl Children's Project that she used in 1995 because the sarcophagus built in great haste over the destroyed reactor that cost lives to build it is very fragile.
Right.
And so
when can it erupt in a sense, right?
And she was warning that sarcophagus could collapse. It could just collapse and cause another huge release. And so another layer was put over the old sarcophagus. It's called the new safe confinement. It cost $3 billion to build. They had to build it a third of a mile away because the dose rates were too high at the site. The largest movable object in human history. They rolled it on the tracks over the old sarcophagus to contain what's in there. And the plan was to dismantle the sarcophagus inside, dismantle the destroyed reactor, and try to deal with what's still in there. And wouldn't you know, on Valentine's Day, the Russian military attacked the new safe confinement with an explosive drone. And I saw the picture and I thought, maybe that hole can be patched. What I didn't know, there's recently a New York Times article It set fire to the new safe confinement. There were membranes to prevent water from coming in, and the entire north face of this structure is dysfunctional now.
Yeah.
And it's almost hard to wrap your head around. It's not contained as we speak. The next Chernobyl could still be Chernobyl.
Mm-hmm. Kevin KAMPS, up to us to open up these issues and discuss nuclear waste and containment and deposition and disposal and so on. Thank you so much, and we will continue this heading into the next half hour here on the Paradigm Shift Cafe, and also revered local and respected environmentalist Graham Saunders with me in the studio. Thank you both, you gentlemen, for coming in here and informing me and educating me about these matters. We're going to butter some CILU bread here on the Wiley Coyote on the Paradigm Shift Cafe, and we've got a Neil Young song coming up. He's a nice bridge. I've always felt he's a great bridge between Canada and the United States, because he formed a lot of his early fame here, of course, and then pursued his ambitions in the United States of America. And he's always been a voice, not only for the environment and for humanity generally, but he's also a proud American, and he believes in all the good things about America too. There's far too much divisive talk going on, so we'll keep it rolling here on the Paradigm Shift.
CILU is supported in part by the students of Lakehead University, our listeners, and our sponsors.
There you go, Kevin. A little Kevin KAMPS in conversation around nuclear issues. There's Neil Young on containment. And you were just saying, showing your knowledge of your baby boomer background of Graham Nash wrote a song about resistance to the Yucca Mountain stuff.
Well,
nice
it was actually
tie-in.
Stephen Still's son, who became a keyboardist for Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young.
Okay.
He was the songwriter on, it's called Don't Dig Here.
Right.
And it was
Okay.
a song
Nice.
about the Yucca Mountain dump. Yeah.
I'll have to check that one out for sure. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I guess buried under a mountain, that'll solve things, right? Yeah.
Well, we stopped them, but
Yeah.
like I said,
It's ongoing.
they've got new dumps proposed in Texas and New Mexico. We're actually before the U.S. Supreme Court, and they will rule by the end of June. And even if our side wins, and we have a crazy coalition put together, we are in coalition with the governor of Texas, if you can believe it. And a part of the reason why is that there's an oil company in our coalition. They hold the mineral rights under these targeted sites for the nuke waste dumps, and they don't like it. And so they convinced the governor of Texas.
It's a two-edged. They got mineral rights as well, right?
Well, it's unfortunate that the Permian Basin of Texas and New Mexico is becoming the most active oil field in the world, more active than Saudi Arabia. So they're destroying that neck of the woods down there with their fossil fuel activities. But in strange coalition fashion, very strange bedfellows, we are on the same side of this fight against the nuke waste dumps. And so this oil company, with its wealth and its attorneys, of course, the governor of Texas and the attorney general of Texas, but that Republican side of things, the part of our coalition, is matched by the Democratic side of things in New Mexico, where the governor and the state legislature are opposed to both dumps. The dumps are on either side of the Texas-New Mexico border. They're within 40 miles of each other. Mm-hmm. And so it's an attempt to turn that area into a radioactive waste sacrifice area for the country. And a part of the history is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which is the first repository in the world for nuclear waste, but specifically it's plutonium-contaminated military waste, is just 16 miles away from the New Mexico targeted site for high-level waste and not that far away from the Texas one. So they got their foot in the door down there in the 1970s, but they didn't open the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant until 1999. So it's kind of like a company town for the nuclear industry, and that history all began with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos in 1943. So New Mexico has suffered gravely from the nuclear industry since then. It's a majority-minority state. The Latino and indigenous population of New Mexico is the majority. So this is a huge environmental justice issue. They have no consent from either New Mexico or Texas for these dumps. We may yet stop them. And like I said, radioactive waste whack-a-mole, there's a long list of new dump targets that the Department of Energy is
proposing,
doing as we speak.
Right. So you say a majority in New Mexico and a majority minority, so you've got majority of Latino folks and then minority being the indigenous folks?
No,
Oh, no.
the majority of the state population is the combination of Latino and indigenous. And you have Pueblo nations,
Sure.
2 dozen.
And very strong traditions in the New Mexico area, right? That way.
Navajo, Dene, and Apache. You have this just beautiful diversity of indigenous
Right.
culture and identity and sovereignty in
Right.
New Mexico. And wouldn't you know, that's what's being targeted, because even the Texas dump is 0.3 miles from the state line of New Mexico. It's in extreme West Texas in more ways than one.
Mhm.
Extreme ruby red Republican West Texas. Despite that, even the host county, Andrews County, Texas, is opposed to becoming the high-level radioactive waste dump for the country, even though they are already the national low-level radioactive waste dump. They just wanted to start bringing high-level waste to this low-level waste dump, and the low-level waste dump is a real problem. This is all above the Oglala Aquifer, the biggest aquifer in North America that stretches across 8 states of the Great Plains. Some 30 million people depend on it for drinking water, and then it irrigates the crops and cattle ranches that feed the country. And they're putting the radioactive waste on top of that. So I think things move downward with gravity, so that could be a problem over time.
This is going to sound really kindergarten and naive, but is it possible to even say that one party or the other is better on the environment or environmental issues? It seems like environmental issues are just sort of beyond all parties, or in some ways.
Well, on this nuclear issue, I mean, the Republicans almost to a member, unless it's a place like Nevada that's been targeted, there will be Republicans who stand up against being, dumped on. But Republicans largely almost to a member are pro-nuclear.
Mm-hmm.
But the Democrats, there were always pro-nuclear Democrats, but unfortunately under Biden, they really betrayed us. The Democrats have really betrayed the environmental movement and the people on the nuclear issue. In Michigan, this restart at Palisades was first proposed by the Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer. But I think that Biden's energy secretary, Jennifer Granholm, who was governor of Michigan, she was attorney general before that, became Biden's energy secretary. She was born in Canada. She naturalized as a U.S. citizen, which means she could never run for president, but she came pretty darn close. She was energy secretary. She was for the continued operations at Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in California. She got Governor Gavin Newsom to reverse his position on that issue. And then in Michigan. And so the Biden administration, with huge bailouts for the restarts and for all things nuclear, new small modular reactor construction.
Yeah, we're getting that incursion up here too.
So the Democrats have really betrayed us on the nuclear power issue. And we're hoping to turn that around somehow, but it's going to be a uphill battle for a while.
It's the money that talks and walks, right?
They claim it's a climate solution, but we can get more into that.
Let's touch on that if you would then. I mean,
Yeah.
because that's kind of an important thing.
Yeah.
So they pitch it as, so to go right to the basics of that. It's always been nuclear is clean and green, or clean and green's another thing, right? But
Kind of a strange glowing shade of green. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So how isn't it? First of all, how and why do they pitch it as clean? This is going way back, or people's misnomers about it and so on. If you could flesh that out, and then why is it clearly not?
Well, I think this claim of clean is really Orwellian. I mean, there is a lot of attention on the climate and greenhouse gas emissions, very appropriately so. Yes, indeed. But it's not the only environmental issue. There's toxic chemicals, there's species extinction, there's habitat loss, there's other environmental issues besides greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, although it is very important. And so this claim of clean is simply focusing the discussion only on greenhouse gas emissions. Nuclear power is not carbon-free at all. It is very carbon-intensive at the mining, milling, processing.
Right, you've talked about this in your online videos and interviews.
Fuel fabrication. Even the operating reactors release greenhouse gases. Maybe it's a low level compared to fossil fuels, of course, but then there's that fun little topic of radioactive waste. And my joke about it, but it's not funny, is, okay, how much greenhouse gases will be released during the management of forever deadly radioactive waste? I mean, high-level radioactive waste is hazardous for 1,000,000 years into the future. We have to make sure it doesn't get out into the environment. We have to contain it. So good luck with that. That's going to be an immense carbon footprint, trying to contain high-level radioactive waste for 1,000,000 years into the future. So it's false to say that nuclear power is clean, because the radioactive waste alone, let alone the so-called routine radiation releases from operating reactors and the entire uranium fuel chain, uranium is a toxic heavy metal that is also radioactive. And then when it passes through an operating reactor, now the radioactivity levels are multiplied by 1,000,000. There are artificial radioactive elements now that biology doesn't know what to do with. They are hazardous to humans and all life forms and have to be contained. It's not clean, but
isn't it something weird? I mean, just to jump in here for a second, Kevin, it can pass through human skin, but it can't pass through paper. That's why we have these paper suits that sometimes when we're out.
Well, those would be the alpha particles, like plutonium.
Yeah.
Plutonium is an alpha particle emitter. Paper can stop it, but you sure don't want to breathe it in to your lung, because technically speaking, a single molecule of plutonium, which is pretty small amount, can initiate lung cancer. It may take years, it may take decades, but the initiation has begun. And there's this horrible story from Bruce Nuclear Generating Station in Kincardine, Ontario, on Lake Huron, the largest nuclear power plant in the world by number of reactors. There are 9 reactors there, 8 still operating.
Did not know that either.
The CANDO design has some problems, and one of them is you have to replace safety critical systems fairly often at huge expense, including to human health, because this incident, probably a decade ago now, I don't remember exactly when it happened, but they were grinding through pipes that were internally contaminated with significant radioactivity, and they had taken no safety precautions against airborne alpha particles. There were no respirators worn. 500 workers were exposed to alpha inhalation doses. And like I said, it doesn't take much to initiate lung cancer. So the question remains, are they tracking the health of these 500 workers who breathed in plutonium and other alpha emitting particles on the job due to the incompetence, carelessness of their
procedures,
superiors, the management and the government that was supposed to protect these workers? So it's not clean for the workers. It's not clean for the locals. It's not clean for the planet. It's not clean.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of these? And this is another quirky question, but you've got the horrendous events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Sort of well documented. In fact, there's even a kind of a crazy the original documentary that the government, United States, documented the whole thing from plutonium processing and white lab coats and vials of this and that to the dropping of the bombs and the classic imagery that we've seen, cameras on the ground and from the air and documenting everything. And they even said right within the documentary that it was clearly, and they knew they were doing an experiment on the effects of radiation on human lives. Like, how dark is that, first of all?
Right.
But what do you make of these kind of claims that people say, oh, there's wolves and bears around Chernobyl now, and there's a whole rebuilt cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with flowers and parks, and maybe they're lying to us about the effects of it. I mean, that's a major devil's advocate question, but how do we reconcile the life reappearing and so on?
Well, the greenwashing at Chernobyl is pretty amazing stuff. Yeah. So I met a biologist named Blinov in Belarus, and his job as a top-notch biologist was to go into the dead villages in Belarus and probably even in Ukraine at the time, because this was the mid-90s, and document what was happening to the biology. And so, there are wolves, there are endangered species reoccupying the Chernobyl region. Why is that? Because there are no people there. So their top threat is humans hunting them.
Well, what kind of shape are they in, probably, right?
Well, his point was he came around a corner in a dead village and he saw 50 black storks, which are an endangered species. And instead of being overjoyed, he was devastated because these endangered species, like the black storks, are being damaged genetically by where they've taken up living Chernobyl. The radioactive contamination is damaging their endangered genetics. And it's not just one biologist in Belarus. There's a biologist from the University of South Carolina who is Canadian, by the way. His name is Timothy Mousseau. He has done dozens or scores or even hundreds of biological studies in Chernobyl and now Fukushima, and they are devastating. The bird population, there are entire species that should be there that aren't there in Chernobyl. There are individuals still living that he discovers, but they are born without eyes. So as a bird without eyes, you're not going to last very long. So he has documented the immense biological devastation. One of his studies that really floored me was called zombie forests. The microscopic life that would decay wood when it dies, when a tree dies, is not present in the ecology. So year after year, the forests and the grasses grow, and then they fall back, and they collect as debris on the forest floor, not being decomposed,
for further
and it's
life.
a tinderbox.
Right.
They have had countless wildfires in the Chernobyl region that have to be put out. So yet again, humans being exposed to radioactivity in the smoke, because this entire landscape is saturated with radioactive cesium and other hazards. They have to try to stop these wildfires. They had one that, this was a decade ago, that burned very close to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was putting the radioactive waste at Chernobyl in danger. And so yeah, the zombie forests was a really devastating study that Mousseau put out. So
it's almost like the damage is often it's not readily observable to an untrained eye, because we're talking about genetic and reproductive areas and DNA and.
Well, the reason they've put a large region out of human habitation, it's called the Chernobyl dead zone in common parlance. It's not safe to live there. Some people sneak in who have no other options, or they're from there.
They say there are people living inside the zone, right? Because
a lot of times it's elderly people who are from there.
Right.
And a lot of them have probably passed on, because we're going on, the 40th anniversary now of Chernobyl. But they wanted to die where they were from. They didn't want to live as refugees in big cities where they had no friends, family, resources. So they went back to their home villages secretly, and the government kind of turned a blind eye. But you're not supposed to have children in there. You're not supposed to be rearing families in there.
Right, right.
So, and then just briefly on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one way to wrap your head around how can cities rebuild on the site of atomic bombings? Well, think of the quantity of nuclear material. I don't know the exact figure, but it was tens of pounds of uranium in the Hiroshima bomb. And the nuclear reaction that exploded was measured in seconds at most. So that's a nuclear reaction of tens of pounds of uranium that lasted for seconds. And so most of the death and injury was due to the blast. But yes, there was
fire,
there was radiation damage, certainly so, including genetic damage, and also stillbirths and even birth defects, and certainly cancer from people who were exposed to that brief blast of massive radiation.
Right.
Yes, there was damage. But the contamination lingering beyond was tens of pounds of uranium that only fissioned for seconds. Compare that to a nuclear reactor where you have 200 tons of uranium that is fissioning for years on end. And so you can see that even in the radioactive waste quantities, 95% of the radioactive waste in the world is from nuclear power plants. And 5% is everything else, including military, including medical, because of how long and how much fissioning going on in the cores of atomic reactors.
Right. Help us with a term that's, you kind of hear, well, this stuff doesn't even begin to break down for a couple 100,000 years, or the half-life. That's right. Help me with that terminology.
Yeah, it's
very perplexing.
There's more than 200 different radioactive isotopes.
Okay.
Most of them artificial, coming out of atomic reactors. So some examples: tritium, radioactive hydrogen, which can make water and water vapor radioactive. It has a 12.3 year half-life. You multiply the half-life by 10 at least, if not 20 to be more careful. that gives you the hazardous persistence. So a 12.3 year half-life times 10 is 123 years. And then after that, it has radioactively decayed, or maybe 246 years. And it's an important one to bring up because the CANDU reactors in Canada are tritium production machines. They make massive amounts of tritium. And unfortunately, because hydrogen is so small, it's very difficult to filter. It's very difficult to contain. Tritium can even pass through certain grades of steel. So it's hard to contain. And so what is the regulatory response? It is, well, we'll just release it into the environment. If it gets out, it will dilute. The Great Lakes are huge. It'll dilute in the Great Lakes. That's not a good approach because tritium can go anywhere in the human body that hydrogen goes. And yeah, it may have a relatively low level beta emission, but if it's in your DNA molecule, when it has its beta emission, that can cause cancer, that can cause birth defects, that can cause genetic damage.
Drops in reproduction and so on. Yeah.
And then other radioactive isotopes kind of on the top 5 list would be cesium-137, which seeks human muscle tissue, including the heart. That is a 30-year half-life, 300 to 600 years of hazard, a major bad actor at Chernobyl, at Fukushima. A similar half-life would be strontium-90, 30-year half-life, 300 to 600 years of hazard, a bone seeker, ultra-hazardous. And then the figure you mentioned, 240,000 years, that's the hazardous persistence of plutonium-239, which has a 24,000-year half-life. And then one to just put out there, I said 1 million years of hazard associated with high-level radioactive waste, unless you consider the artificial radioactive isotope iodine-129, which has a 15.7 million year half-life. That is 157 million years to 314 million years of hazard, and it's in high-level radioactive waste. It could lodge in the human thyroid gland for the next 100 million years and cause damage. And ironically enough, there are multiple isotopes of the same element. So iodine-131, which was a major bad actor at Chernobyl, but also at Fukushima, only has an 8-day half-life, an 80-day to 160-day hazardous persistence, and yet it was one of the major health problems downwind of Chernobyl because cows would eat grass contaminated with iodine-131. It would get in the milk, it would get in the butter and the cheese.
Yeah.
And people were eating it,
Food chain.
even breathing it. And at Fukushima, there were elevated levels of iodine-131 in the drinking water. And so they actually put out warnings to pregnant women in Tokyo, don't drink the tap water, drink bottled water, to try to protect the fetus against the iodine-131 because a fetus is so very vulnerable to radioactive harm. And but the thyroid pathology downwind of Chernobyl was tremendous. A rare disease, thyroid cancer, was now a common disease. And the practice was to remove the thyroid gland in Belarus, and the nickname for the procedure was a Belarus necklace. You are left with a scar from ear to ear that you will have for the rest of your life. And you are now going to have, as happened to the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if it comes out that you are a Chernobyl survivor with a Belarus necklace,
You probably ain't getting a job or anything
job,
else.
marriage, yeah,
You
it has
name it,
huge
yeah,
consequences for your life.
Yeah. Kevin Kamps in conversation here with Wiley Coyote on the Paradigm Shift Cafe. I thank you again, Kevin, for coming in. We've got probably another good half hour ahead of us before you've got another engagement to go to. And I'm not surprised, and I will just point out to my listeners, you haven't once glanced at your phone or notes with quoting a lot of these facts and figures and chemicals and otherwise scary microscopic type knowledge. And it's frankly quite impressive because that's the part that I have trouble memorizing is the facts and figures around this stuff. But you live and breathe it, and I'm glad that you do live and breathe it, and that your heart and soul are obviously in it. The nuclear waste issues and dilemmas that are facing us, and the politics and money and big business around it. So thank you very much again, and we'll continue this conversation here on the Paradigm Shift Cafe coming up the next half hour at least, and we'll make a couple of announcements and return with a usual song or two, and we'll be right back. Thanks for having us along on your Friday afternoon. This is CILU 1027 on your FM dial around the World Wide Web, www.luradio.ca. We're back with the Paradigm Shift Cafe in conversation with Kevin Kamps about all things nuclear. And Kevin, let's go for a moment and see where it goes in the next 20 minutes or so. About you and I tend to agree that nuclear power for the people being pitched as it always has been as a greener thing, mysteriously so. But we've talked a little bit about the falsehood around that, and that it's sort of efficient and whatever it is they say. But that it's really, in my estimation, a kind of byproduct and a window dressing of an otherwise thrust toward nuclear power in the weaponry industry. And I'm even using gentle language here. So, what do you say about that, or where do you weigh in?
A good friend of mine, Alfred Meyer, who works with Physicians for Social Responsibility in New York City, wrote an essay for the Progressive magazine out of Madison, Wisconsin, some years ago, and it was entitled "It's All About the Bomb." Right. And so Alfred's point was that this smiley face facade of nuclear power, atoms for peace, is really just a cover for the nuclear weapons arsenals. And there's a book that really works this out. It's Dr. Arjun Makhijani, Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, and the book is called The Nuclear Power Deception. And one of the stories he tells in there is when Eisenhower gave his Atoms for Peace speech in 1953, where did all the uranium go from 1953 for the next 25 years? It went into the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal. So Atoms for Peace was a sales pitch to convince people that all things nuclear, the uranium mining, milling, processing, the reactors out at Hanford that were making plutonium for the bombs, no, this was all Atoms for Peace. This is the phoenix from the ashes. Nuclear power is going to be too cheap to meter. It's inherently safe. Think of the applications in agriculture. But there were no reactors. The first civilian reactor that, oh, by the way, was built by the U.S. Nuclear Navy and operated by U.S. Nuclear Navy officers in 1957, Shippingport, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. That was the first reactor. Then there was another one in Michigan, Big Rock Point, and another one near Chicago, Dresden. There were a handful of reactors. Not until the 1970s did more and more reactors come online. So those initial decades, the entire uranium supply was going into the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal. Right. And some of that uranium was coming from Canada, places like Elliott Lake, Ontario, which is devastated to this day with radioactive and toxic chemical contamination. The Serpent River First Nation there, supplying uranium to the United States for its nuclear weaponry. Mm-hmm. And it's still the case now. I mean, unfortunately, even under Obama, and still now, there is a $2 trillion nuclear weapons modernization plan underway in the United States. We're not abolishing our nuclear weapons. We're
ramping up.
We're expanding it, yeah. New military uses, and it's in total contradiction to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that more and more countries are ratifying. It's a very hopeful thing. But in the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970, the United States, in good faith, with all deliberate speed, was supposed to enter negotiations to abolish nuclear weapons. Well, that was 56 years ago now.
Well, didn't the United States, weren't the United States largely responsible for initiating the sort of constitution and the thrust around the UN itself, but haven't really been participatory for some time? Isn't that a weird...
I find it ironic, and I'm not an expert, but the fact that the Security Council permanent members are the United States, the UK, Russia, France, and China, right. Nuclear weapons powers. I mean, it's very ironic. And there are now more nuclear weapons powers. There's India and Pakistan. There's Israel. And the list could go on. That's a part of the problem with nuclear power, is if you have uranium enrichment for nuclear power, supposedly, if you have plutonium reprocessing for nuclear power, supposedly, you can choose to redirect those technologies to nuclear weapons production. Mm-hmm. It's how the nuclear weapons powers got their nuclear weapons, some of them under the pretense that all they were doing was nuclear power. No, they were doing nuclear weapons behind the smokescreen of nuclear power.
Now, assumably, you're a young-looking lad, but you're of the generation that was instructed to have little emergency alerts in school and hiding under your desks. Is that comforting to you now to know that you can hide under a desk against
Well,
mushroom cloud?
I'm 55, and I only had one duck and cover drill, and it was in high school. So that was before my time mostly, but they did one.
Yeah.
But I did grow up fearful, privately fearful. There wasn't a lot of talk about nuclear war. In 7th grade science class, my teacher put an article on the bulletin board. It was a local letter to the editor in the Kalamazoo Gazette. What would happen to Kalamazoo if there was nuclear war? And we had a facility nearby that made a part for nuclear weapons, for rockets. And I forget the megawattage of the hydrogen bomb that the Soviets would fire at Kalamazoo. Let's assume that it exploded over that Central Park where I stumbled on that Hiroshima commemoration. And what was described was, and this was a Physicians for Social Responsibility campaign, this letter to the editor, I found out later, concentric circles of destruction. And hydrogen bombs are 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So my entire hometown, out to a great distance, would be destroyed and everyone killed.
Sure.
And so as a 7th grader, how old are you? 11 or 12? I was, impressed by that. And then I saw the day after on television, like 100 million other people, sat there with my mom and watched that.
The nuclear winter sort of thing.
And this was all before I got involved. So it was building towards me getting involved.
And I can't remember which order they came out, but, a very gifted American author, Cormac McCarthy, I love his stuff. And he wrote a book called The Road about some kind of weird accident that happened in the
That
States.
he never explained.
He never explained it in the book at all, no. But it opens with a couple living sort of in a semi, a rural area. And the catastrophe had happened, and media was cut off, and they were isolated, and the male and female, and she basically walks off and commits suicide alone, and then he's left walking through an ashed out America
With a child.
Yeah, and he eventually makes it down to the Gulf of Mexico. I'm stuttering because it's the Gulf of America, right?
Well, Lake Michigan was just renamed Lake Illinois, so anything goes these days.
Yeah, anything goes. But so and I even have a friend who had an ayahuasca vision, believe it or not, of being transported across a burning, ashed out America on the wings of a giant raven. So we're getting signals. It's not to be doom and gloom, but I think it behooves us to pay attention to our politics and the corporatocracy.
Well, President Kennedy warned in the early 1960s that we had better abolish nuclear weapons or they may abolish us. And so here we are, and don't take it from a liberal Democratic President Kennedy, take it from Henry Kissinger around 20 years ago now. They were called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse.
Right.
And Henry Kissinger was one of them, whose entire career was based on essentially threatening other countries, either with conventional war or nuclear war.
High-tech,
And he pretty much said with his colleagues there, who were as eminent as he was as a high-level statesman or whatever, we had better abolish nuclear weapons. It is the only existential threat to the United States. Instead of that, like I said, we are modernizing and expanding our nuclear weapons in the United States. So somehow we think we're immune from this stuff, but we're not. Of course, it's a small planet. Chernobyl,
it really is, and I'm reminded of an analogy from good old Carl Sagan, who said, imagine that you and I two people are standing in a room knee deep in gasoline. I've got one match and a striker, and you've got a box of matches and a striker. Mm-hmm. Does it matter how many matches you've got and I've got?
Right. This whole notion of deterrence will save us.
We should be way beyond this kind of behavior that violence and war solves anything.
Well, there were
even with old-fashioned weapons. 2
close calls with nuclear war that were prevented by heroic, courageous actions by Soviet military officers. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine commander voted no on launching nuclear-tipped torpedoes at U.S. warships that were depth charging them, knocking out the air supply on the subs, and he voted no. It needed to be a unanimous vote. The U.S. didn't even know there were nuclear-tipped torpedoes on these submarines that they were depth charging, and they thought that the Kremlin would have to sign off, and the president was in touch with the Kremlin, so maybe they could be talked out of firing. They didn't even know they had nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and this commanding officer voted no. And so the man who saved the world, and it happened again.
Ended up being a Russian in this case.
Yeah, he was a Soviet submarine
human
commander.
being, obviously.
And in 1983, another near miss with nuclear war, the Soviet incoming missile detection system mistook essentially sunrise for a U.S. missile launch. And he realized there was something wrong with the warning that was being issued. There was something wrong with the system.
Yeah.
And against orders, he did not fire in response to this mistaken U.S. launch.
Again, a human instinct in that case, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's many more stories like that, close calls with nuclear war.
Right.
By mistake.
One wonders, again, I switched to philosophy for a moment, but one wonders what it's going to take to kind of restore some equanimity, some sanity, and just a more calmer direction about, in times when we've got, the rearing up of war again, in obviously the Gaza Strip and the Ukraine-Russian conflict and so on. One wonders what it's going to take, but I hope that more people get involved. We've got a Canadian federal election coming up, that they at least participate. I've been involved in the Green Party myself, and one of the things that people aren't necessarily aware of in that platform, it's not just environmental stuff, it's also the restoration of what we call participatory democracy. Not only participating in our own democracy by voting and voicing concerns, but also imploring and expecting and asking our own governments to participate in our democracy. And to end the separation of the we and they, or however you want to say that, between the people and the government, right?
Well, I've learned a lot being up here the last few days from Environment North. And, the fight is on here about this high-level radioactive waste dump targeting this area. There's a phrase from Helen Caldicott from Australia, who's just a giant in the anti-nuclear movement. She said, if you see a good fight, jump in it.
Jump in.
And that's actually a phrase from the civil rights movement in the United States. So there is a good fight brewing here right now. They want to turn your area into a national high-level radioactive waste dump for Canada.
I know.
Even though you have no reactors nearby, they're going to export it here over great distances. I mean, Point Lepreau, New Brunswick, wants to send its high-level radioactive waste here. So the transportation risks you mentioned earlier over that long distance. Why? What?
Makes no sense.
And the studies haven't even begun on, is the geology appropriate? You mentioned there's water flow through this rock up here, and this material's deadly for a million years. But the thing is, when you build a dump like that underground, you are piercing that geology. Some good news, we stopped dumps targeting the Lake Huron shoreline in Kincardine at the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station. The Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, despite the money they were being offered, they voted 84% to 16% no. This is not happening. That stopped that dump. So then they moved down to South Bruce. That was stopped. But unfortunately, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, in response to that, said, okay, how about Ignace? So here we go again. But when you pierce the geology, well, now there's a way for the waste to get out. You've pierced the geology.
Exactly.
And then there's the water flow. And then there's the transportation. There's the surface facilities that could go wrong. I mean, Yucca Mountain, Nevada, according to Dr. Arjun Makhijani, who I mentioned before with that book, The Nuclear Power Deception, he was a strong critic of Yucca Mountain, Nevada, even though he's a proponent of geologic disposal. And his reasons for that include nuclear weapons proliferation. The plutonium in the waste can be extracted and used in nuclear weaponry. So it's sitting around on the surface is a problem. And it has been sitting around on the surface for 80 years in some cases at this point. So, but he pointed out that Yucca Mountain, Nevada was the worst site ever studied to serve as a repository for high-level nuclear waste. It's a earthquake zone, it's a volcanic zone, and the ground is saturated with groundwater. And that site would fail significantly. After about 10,000 years, there would be large flows of radioactivity into the groundwater that then surfaces as springs.
Insidiously here and there,
Just taking out that whole region of the planet with high-level radioactive contamination.
Making for fewer and fewer surface areas, or below the surface, for that matter, safely habitable areas for humans and other.
And these wounded sites, Chernobyl, Fukushima, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, were not contaminated, but they were bombed. And it's a small planet. The bombings, the fallout from the testing, the fallout from the disasters. It's a small planet.
We're still looking for, there's whole sort of volunteer societies throughout Europe were still looking for actual landmines that were put in place. I don't know, did they do such things in the First World War? Certainly the Second World War. We're still trying to track all those down and make sure that landscapes are safe again for kids to run around.
No, there's World War One. I believe they're explosives or maybe toxic explosives showing up in residential neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., near American University, which used to be countryside at the World War One time period. And they just buried their wastes, some of which was explosive and certainly toxic, mustard gas.
Right.
And now it's showing up in people's yards when they go to build a swimming pool.
Right.
And also contaminating the soil and the water in these residential neighborhoods.
So speaking of such matters, practical matters of deposition or discarding and so on and so forth, HOSS, H-O-S-S. I've been instructed to ask you about this. Is hot on-surface storage?
Hardened on-site storage. Hardened on-site storage.
Thank you, HOSS. Okay, so why are you a proponent of that, more or less? Yeah, so talk about that term then. And
Dr. Makajani, who I mentioned, coined the phrase and kind of developed the concept. And what it is to take on-site storage seriously, because that's what we've got right now, rather than rushing into these ill-advised dumps like Ignace.
This is all I'm saying too. Yeah.
So fortify the wastes on site against attack, safeguard the wastes on site at nuclear power plants against accidents. None of this is happening, actually. Right now, as we speak, about 2/3 of the high-level radioactive waste ever generated is still in the indoor wet storage pools at these nuclear power plant sites, and the overflow storage in the parking lot is dry cask storage, about 1/3. Vast quantities at nuclear power plant sites like Bruce Nuclear Generating Station or Pickering or Darlington. And so wouldn't it make sense, first things first, to safeguard and secure the waste that exists where it's at before attempting to rush into transportation and dump locating? And so just an example of how big a catastrophe could unfold from a pool. Fukushima Daiichi, unit number 4, wasn't even operating on March 11th, 2011. Its fuel had been moved into the storage pool there. But the explosion at unit 3, one of the meltdowns, also damaged unit 4 severely, actually. They were connected units. And so for a number of weeks, the Japanese government didn't know if there was cooling water in the pool at unit 4. They were taking dramatic actions in response. They were picking up water with helicopters, self-defense forces helicopters from the ocean, trying to drop it on the pool to make sure there was cooling water in that pool. They couldn't tell, because if there wasn't, certainly nobody could get close, because if there was not enough cooling water, which is the radiation shielding too, you would be killed instantly.
Aren't there cams on these to actually
They were
see
trying to take photographs from the sky, but the carnage below, the destruction, prevented a clear line of sight. And so through sheer luck, there was water in the pool. It was discovered later. They eventually realized they could take cranes and run hoses up the cranes and shoot water into the pool. They didn't know how much was going in.
Yeah.
They're taking all these actions. What happened was sheer luck or divine intervention, depending on your worldview. The gate between the reactor cavity and the pool had been damaged, probably by the explosion, but maybe by the earthquake. I don't know what caused the damage on the edges of the gate, separating the two. The water that was luckily in the reactor cavity, it could have been emptied previously, but there was water in there that flowed around the damaged gate into the pool. If that hadn't happened, that pool would have boiled down to the top of the nuclear fuel in a month or less. And then within hours of that fuel being exposed to air, it would have been on fire. And then like sparklers, that burn would have gone down the fuel, and the entire inventory in the pool would have combusted. And volatile radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 could have escaped at 100% levels into the environment. And to give you an idea of what that would have looked like, the Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan, who was serving at the time, a year later, he was now out of office. At the anniversary, March 11th of 2012, he admitted publicly, in the New York Times, he was quoted, that he had a secret contingency plan in the works if that pool had caught fire to evacuate 35 million to 50 million residents of northeastern Japan, Metro Tokyo. To where is a good question. Japan's a small country in land area.
For sure.
He said it would have been the end of the Japanese state if that pool had caught fire. It would have dwarfed the nuclear catastrophe that did happen. In the United States, I can say confidently that the pools are much more dangerous just in terms of how much waste is in them than what happened at Unit 4 at Fukushima Daiichi. Our pools are packed to the gills, sometimes 5 times the amount of waste of the original pool design. And to save money is why they do that.
Yeah, the main thing that which I've learned from folks like Graham Saunders and the local resistance to it here is as you've pointed out, Kevin, transportation over long periods of geography and so on, long spaces of geography, but that it's it really should be a no-brainer and begs the question, why even move it at all? Because then now you're spreading the problem over such an area, and the old facetious, what could go wrong, right? Whether it's highway, rail, or heaven forbid, start putting it on ships in the Great Lakes and so on, right? But so my question is about, I've learned from the folks at Environment North proximity principle which they employ in places like Sweden and Norway, where it's like a 15-kilometer straight highway just for the waste, and it goes and down into some kind of deposition, whether it's on surface or underground. So at least it's close. So it's called the proximity principle, which I'm sure you're aware of. But what I kind of would like to just open up for 1 second here is it's kind of a scientific question. If we have all this heat that's generated and it needs to be cooled and stored in surface swimming pools, so to speak, can we not canister it and harness the energy somehow? I mean, we have all this latent energy. What do you know about any of that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, the most important priority is to safeguard it and prevent catastrophes. So instead of utilizing it, I mean, the most commonly referred to utilization of high-level radioactive waste is reprocessing, which is plutonium extraction. But if you extract plutonium-239 from euphemistically called spent nuclear fuel or used nuclear fuel,
spent bundles,
highly radioactive waste, irradiated nuclear fuel, you can use it for weapons. They say they may be using it for reactor fuel, but it could be used for weapons. So I'm really not a fan of discussing reuse of spent nuclear fuel, but
because it sort of encourages the industry at the same time, doesn't it?
Right, and I think in the Soviet Union and now Russia, I think there was some utilization of spent nuclear fuel for heat. So I was over there on a peace march, and there were large pipes that came from the nuclear plant into the city. They were using heated water from the nuclear plant. It may have been heated water that didn't come into contact with the stored spent nuclear fuel, but
questionable.
I'm not a huge fan.
Okay.
I don't think you should be messing with it. It should be, the top priority should just be containing it, safeguarding it, keeping it cool, and not making any more. That's the only solution.
That's the
we already have so much that we don't know what to do with.
All right, Kevin Kamps, we're just going to take a small break here, and we'll either have to say goodbye to you shortly, or we'll cap it off with a closing few comments from you. Thank you so much for coming in to discuss the issues of nuclear waste, and especially visiting us from the excited gates of America.
My pleasure.
So you and I were talking a little bit off mic, all things nuclear, of course, today on the show, and I thank you again and again for this conversation. I've learned so much, and it's nice to encounter somebody who's not only so invested in it in the right directions, but quite knowledgeable about the specifics of it. And you were talking about reprocessing. So what can we say? What can or should we say about that? Define it first, and how it's dangerous, and where some of the problem spots are. Kevin?
Yeah, reprocessing of high-level nuclear waste is extracting the plutonium-239 and perhaps even the uranium-235, the fissile elements that could be used as reactor fuel, and often that is the supposed excuse for reprocessing. We're going to make reactor fuel out of it.
Right.
But it can also, both of them can be used for nuclear weapons. And in fact, the Manhattan Project, Hanford, Washington, was the plutonium extraction location reprocessing for the Nagasaki bomb. And then during the Cold War, most of the plutonium for the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal came out of Hanford, Washington, but it also came out of Savannah River Site, South Carolina. The weapons-grade uranium came out of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Hanford, Washington, in a nutshell, is reprocessing a good idea? Hanford, Washington, military reprocessing is the most radioactively contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere. The Soviets and the Russians had us beat in terms of worst in the world because they were so careless and sloppy and didn't take any precautions. Sometimes in the Soviet Union, they dumped the high-level radioactive waste liquid into the river, the Teka River, and a Muslim community downstream suffered the consequences of that big time. There was also a Soviet disaster called Chelyabinsk in the Urals, their military reprocessing, where a storage container exploded for lack of cooling, and it took out a region of the Soviet Union. There were maps, so one map before the accident, one map after the accident. Hundreds of towns, villages were not on the new map. They had been evacuated because of this large-scale radioactive disaster. But even commercial reprocessing, as happens in France, as happened in the UK, is environmentally ruinous. It's astronomically expensive, and there's always that risk that the extracted plutonium and uranium could be used in weapons if the person holding it chooses to do so. So we are facing renewed threats of reprocessing in the United States. Thankfully, Presidents Ford and Carter in the 1970s, Ford banned the export of reprocessing. Why did he do that? Because India had used U.S. reprocessing technology and know-how to get to its bomb in 1974.
Right.
But they'd also used a CANDU reactor. So it was a U.S.-Canadian assist to India, maybe not intentionally, but that's how the technology was used by India to get their nuclear weapons going.
Kind of a blindfold assist, if you will.
Yeah, there was an element. They should have known.
And we also, we let's face it, we know the science, so there's no not knowing in a sense, right?
And President Carter, when he won that election against Ford, banned reprocessing domestically, thankfully. So it's never come back in the U.S., but they're always trying. In fact, the French reprocessing company, Areva, now called Orano, is the lead partner in the Texas dump, which is called Interim Storage Partners. Once they consolidate all this waste in one place, the next thing to do would be to reprocess it. And Orano, the biggest reprocessor in the Western world from France, clearly wants to do that. They keep trying in the U.S., and this would be their big chance now. They'd have 40,000 metric tons of highly radioactive waste. They want the plutonium. That's what they do in France. And they've made a mess of the English Channel, and their contamination has flowed all the way to the Canadian Arctic. You can fingerprint where it's coming from. It's coming from La Hague Reprocessing Center in France. And the airborne releases, they come out as noble gases. They're radioactive noble gases, but they quickly decay into biologically interactive radioactive isotopes. So this is devastating for the environment, let alone, and in France and in the UK, there is an overlap between commercial nuclear power and the nuclear weapons industry.
Noble gas, sorry?
Noble gas means chemically inactive, biologically. So supposedly no biological impact, except for when it quickly turns into biologically interactive radioactive isotopes, which is what happens. But they take advantage of the fact that when it goes out the smokestack, that's what their propaganda says. There's no biological impact. It's a noble gas.
Mm. How I'm kind of like preaching to the choir here, but how aware are you? I know you run in a fairly environmentally conscious circle, no doubt in your life, but how aware would you say generally folks, even on the lower level of political awareness, are in the United States about the urgency of these matters regarding nuclear waste? What would be your assessment of, like, the level of optimism or whatever?
Well, you see it in the polling. I mean, when Fukushima happened, all of a sudden people were concerned for a time, and nuclear power in polling wasn't doing so well. But as time goes on, people forget. And there's also the propaganda juggernaut of the industry. I mean, there's a line that came out of Nevada, which was targeted for the Yucca Mountain dump and also the nuclear weapons testing for decades. The spinning of the splitting of the atom. So this industry spins more than it splits. They're constantly lying. They're constantly deceiving, false information. Oh, and then there's the money being offered to potential host communities for high-level radioactive waste dumps just think about it. If you just think about it, we'll give you hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right.
And even if you say no, we'll give you another package of money just
To
for
extend
taking
the
part.
process. Yeah.
But if
That's what we've got
you're
going
willing, if you're willing to come down the road with us, boy, there's money to be had. And there in the United States, it's still going on. It's happened before. The top targets in the United States are often Native American reservations, indigenous nations, and they're at it again. I mentioned we may yet stop
Around here.
these dumps in Texas and New Mexico, but they have a long list of new targets, and a lot of them are indigenous nations, and there is money involved. And so a quote from Keith Lewis, who was the environmental director at Serpent River First Nation, Elliott Lake Uranium Mining District. He was speaking in terms of that, the uranium mining and the milling, but it applies to radioactive waste dumps. He said, there is nothing moral about bribing a starving man with money.
Right, right.
So all the Serpent River First Nation, mostly men who worked in the mines, who then contracted lung cancer. They were told it was safe. Oh, you don't need a respirator. Yeah, they did need a respirator. It wasn't safe. And they paid with their lives. And that whole community has paid a huge price because the contamination in their landscape, in their homeland, has meant they can't eat traditional foods. The game is contaminated. The plants are contaminated.
It's the modern equivalent of shooting the buffalo to hit their food source.
They mined uranium at Elliott Lake from 1948 until 1996, but the consequences of that mining and milling will persist forever into the future until they do a cleanup. And is it even possible? I mean...
And the irony, of course, is, and what you say is very apropos and appropriate for around here, because we have a massive Anishinaabe nation around here, various communities, remote and otherwise, who are vulnerable to such offers of income in perpetuity into the future and so on. But yeah, like you say, the irony in my mind is they actually have, the indigenous folks do have a lot of power that they're not quite fully exercising, or whether they know it or not. They often don't have the the lawyers and the big political connections and so on and so forth. And we know that story inside out. And it is tragedy within the irony that it does affect their food supply and their landscape and so on.
It's been the honor of my life to work with traditionals and environmentalists in these targeted indigenous nations in the United States to fend off these dumps. And oftentimes it's women who are the leaders of these efforts. And we have, as a coalition, been successful thus far at Yucca Mountain, Nevada, at Skull Valley Goshutes in Utah, and the list goes on to 60 plus indigenous nations that have variously been targeted over the decades. Now there's a new list, but these fights are intense.
There's some great environmental footage, documentaries, that is, in the BC peoples, with the women being sent out to the helicopters landing for mining and mineral surveys and pipeline routing, and the women will be sent out, and they're a much more powerful front, because it doesn't helicopter pilots and mining surveyors and so on, they have to have a little more inherent respect, or and they sent them out with a cameraman, of course, filming it all. So we're living in different times, and they're standing up for the land, and there's some optimism there for sure.
One of my favorite quotes is Winona LaDuke, who's White Earth Ojibwe in Minnesota.
Okay.
Her organization that she led for decades, Honor the Earth, they would do concert tours to raise awareness about the targeting of indigenous communities with radioactive waste dumps to try to stop it, and had amazing acts. I mean, I think that CSNY performed at Honor the Earth concerts. Bonnie Raitt, Jackson Brown, the B-52s.
Right.
The list goes on. John Trudell, the native musician. And her line was, during one of the intermissions between acts, it was in Salt Lake City in the year 2000. She said, "The greatest minds in the nuclear industry have been hard at work for a half century to try to solve this radioactive waste problem. And they finally got a solution. Haul it down a dirt road and dump it on an Indian reservation." Mm-hmm. This was in Salt Lake City, near the Skull Valley Goshutes reservation that was targeted for a dump of 40,000 metric tons of high-level radioactive waste. It actually got a license to construct and operate from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and our coalition still stopped it. They never broke ground.
Right.
So, these fights have been going on for decades, but
they really have.
the
Since
people that you
at least
meet
the 70s.
are the greatest people you'll ever
Yeah.
meet.
Yeah.
Grace Thorpe, Sac and Fox Reservation in Oklahoma. She was the daughter of Jim Thorpe, athlete of the century, her dad. And there was an interesting connection to where I'm from. They were part Potawatomi, Pokagon Potawatomi. That is very close to Kalamazoo. But now they were living in Oklahoma. They were forced to move there in the 1800s. She not only stopped the dump targeted at her reservation in Oklahoma within a matter of days, she called a special election and had the tribal council removed who were interested in the money from the Department of Energy.
Right.
So that ended that. But she took her message on the road for years. She had a group called the National Environmental Coalition of Native Americans, and she helped these 60 other reservation communities fend off the same dump that was targeted at them. So it took these people to really dedicate their lives to this effort, and tremendous self-sacrifice. The leader of the opposition at Mescalero Apache to the dump, Rufina Marie Laws, suffered death threats. She had to go into hiding to protect her life because she opposed the dump targeted at their community.
Yeah. It kind of makes pipelines and pipeline spills look like child's play in a sense.
No, I'm from Kalamazoo, which suffered the worst inland oil spill
I know.
because of Enbridge, 1.4 million gallons. So, the two existential threats that I know of, the lead ones to Lake Michigan right now, are Line 5 across the Straits of Mackinac, also Enbridge, and the Palisades atomic reactor that we've talked about that wants to restart this zombie atomic reactor. Those are two existential threats to the future of Lake Michigan. One is an oil pipeline and one is an atomic reactor. So this dirty, dangerous, expensive energy industry that includes fossil fuels and nuclear needs to be retired, to be polite about it, and needs to be replaced with clean, safe, cost-effective, healthy energy systems. It's very possible to do. I mean, you had brought up a question earlier, and I meant to mention Dr. Mark Jacobson of Stanford University is a world-renowned climate scientist, and he advocates renewables as the most cost-effective and time-effective way to save the climate. Certainly not fossil fuels, of course, and certainly not nuclear because it's so expensive and so slow to deploy. And oh, by the way, has this long list of problems all its own. Dr. Makajani's organization, IEER, put a whole book out about it called Insurmountable Risks, how nuclear cannot save the climate, but has a whole long list of its own problems. Folks like Amory Levin's Rocky Mountain Institute. From a capitalist perspective, okay, we have limited time and limited money to try to save the climate. How are we going to do it? Shouldn't we use the good ideas to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Things like energy efficiency, renewables, storage. No, we're going to waste money and time on nuclear.
Right.
This makes no sense
Now, and
from any perspective.
Yeah, and interesting too. You open up a big one here just toward the end of our time together in a conversation. But the way that nuclear is said to be a saver of the climate change and global warming problem, right? It's
the climate catastrophe will have come and gone by the time nuclear even shows up at the starting line. That's
right.
The problem. So if we go down that road, we won't solve the climate problem, and we'll have all these other problems, including high-level radioactive waste to deal with.
Yeah. It kind of, we live in an area here up in the Canadian Shield of very rugged geography and great old and new hydroelectric power dams. And, as much as that, yes, there's some flooding of coastal areas, and there's some siltation buildup and some mercury, disturbances and so on. But it sure seems like I've always felt that hydroelectric is pretty good energy,
Well, there's that book, Small is Beautiful, by Schumacher. And Winona LaDuke, who I mentioned before, was a lead opponent to the large hydro in Quebec back in the day, early 1990s. I heard her speak
Cree territory,
when I was in college in the early 1990s. She came through Mike Waker College, where I dropped out to join that Peace March.
Right.
And so, oftentimes it's a matter of scale. I mean, how large a region are you going to flood? I mean, you know,
Right.
and microhydro,
Yes.
even down to creeks. I mean, if you were to put in microhydro, you could generate electricity from a creek without even interrupting the flow of the creek. So it's often a question of greed. What is your motivation? Why are you doing this?
Right, right.
And why flood a vast region of ecosystem? Now that's gone. It can't do anything else. It's now underwater. So,
And again, we've had to, you know, the Musks, the Bezoses, the Gates. We've had to invent a new term, centibillionaires. Dudes who otherwise have 100 billion and upwards. Now I'm no wizard with numbers, but you know we know that money multiplies exponentially on its interest alone. These guys will never have to suffer into their 7 generations of families in the future, which is again back to you obviously have shown yourself to be sympathetic, empathetic, and very knowledgeable about the native tribes up here we call bands. But they have a teaching that it's, you know, unto the 7th generation of yet unborn children should we make our decisions about whether something is right or wrong or good or bad in the moment. So
absolutely, and that's the problem with radioactive waste is it's really forever deadly. My mentor, Michael Keegan with Don't Waste Michigan and Coalition for Nuclear Free Great Lakes, which is a U.S.-Canadian binational coalition on these issues. The first time I heard him speak in 1993, he came through Kalamazoo. He said, the actual product, electricity is but the fleeting byproduct. The actual product from atomic reactors is forever deadly radioactive waste. You get 40, 60, 80 years of electricity from an atomic reactor. It gets more dangerous the older it gets. Radioactive waste, like we said, is deadly for 1 million years. So it's very irresponsible and unethical of current generations to look to nuclear power for electricity for a few decades and then curse all future generations with this problem that we haven't solved, and there may not be a solution. Because when we look at these sites for geologic disposal, problems crop up. It may not contain it for as long as it's hazardous.
It's the future generations, if I may, that will be cursing us for,
Exactly.
for our complacency and our apathy and our non-participation in the real issues.
Exactly.
It's like a proxy war. I mean, we can clap our hands and, you know, it's not our business, right?
Well, I've heard Indigenous colleagues say, I want to be a good ancestor.
Right.
How will future generations look
I want
back
to be a
on
good
us?
ancestor. Interesting. Kevin Kamps, thank you, sir, very much for coming into the Paradigm Shift Cafe and gracing us with all of the knowledge and wisdom and compassion that you clearly have around the issue of nuclear waste and all the problems around it. So all
Thanks
the best
for
to you.
having me.
Now, yeah, absolutely. Would you like to signal out? Is there a digital location? I know you're a bit of a okay.
Yeah,
I was going to call you a Luddite for a moment, but you don't claim to be all that digitally savvy. But
I'm a
you do have a
self-admitted
presence.
technophobe, yes. Our website is www.beyondnuclear.org.
Okay.
And if folks want to get a hold of me directly, my email is Kevin, Kevin, at beyondnuclear.org. And if you want to phone me, my cell is 240-462-3216 in the U.S. But I think it works.
Okay. Well, Beyond Nuclear would probably connect most people with you. So that sounds awesome. And again, my great gratitude for not only the visit and the conversation and the knowledge, but for actually just caring, because I think that's going to be the first step for a lot of us, is to some event happens, as was your case, the walk, and you know, all of a sudden you're into a whole community of people who also care, and it behooves us all to honor the ground we walk on, perhaps.
Yes.
Thank you, Kevin.